Part 2, on egoism. In their critiques of altruism, there is much overlap between Nietzsche's and Rand's views. In their beliefs about egoism, there's virtually none. Rand's egoism. To see this, let us begin with a highly abstracted list of 12 components that are integrated into Rand's advocacy of egoism. The life of the individual is the standard of value. Values are objective. They are identifications of an individual's survival needs. Individuals have free will. The volitional capacity is the capacity for reason. Reason is competent to know reality and is an individual's fundamental tool for surviving and flourishing. Reason gives individuals the power to shape their characters, to develop or alter their habits, to control their actions. The development of reason enables individuals to be creative producers rather than merely hunter-gatherers from the environment or parasites upon each other. Consequently, individuals are self-responsible both psychologically and existentially. Consequently, individuals are both ends in themselves and the means to their own ends. And consequently, in social relations, there are no fundamental conflicts of interest. Individuals can and should fundamentally commit to social relations on the basis of win-win trade. All individuals have rights that a moral social system will respect as fundamental. Nietzsche rejects all 12 of the components in the above list, and further, he casts doubt upon the belief that individuals even exist. Nietzsche's rhetoric and system. In this context, the importance of more fundamental philosophy to determining the content of a philosopher's ethical system cannot be overstated in the case of comparing Nietzsche and Rand. Both philosophers developed full philosophical systems, and both argued explicitly the essential connections among all of the elements of their philosophies. Some interpreters of Nietzsche are misled by his rhetorical choices, especially his use of apparently disconnected aphorisms. Nietzsche was aware of this rhetorical risk and took pains to warn his readers against it, explaining that his purpose was not to do the reader's work for him by, in the manner of a schoolteacher, leading him step by step to a conclusion. Instead, a philosopher learns by doing, by taking Nietzsche's often compressed aphorisms and unpacking them and repacking them, by trying them out in various combinations, or, to put the point unflatteringly, by being a cow. Nietzsche's aphorisms to a philosopher should be like grass to a cow, something to be chewed into cud, swallowed, and regurgitated for more chewing, swallowed again, and processed through several stomachs in order to extract the value. A philosopher is a ruminant. Nietzsche further urges the importance of system, again not in mechanical terms, but rather in his overall philosophy's organic terms. Quote, "We have no right to isolated acts of any kind. We may not make isolated errors or hit upon isolated truths. Rather do our ideas, our values, our yeas and nays, our ifs and buts, grow out of us with the necessity with which a tree bears fruit, related, and each with an affinity to each other, and evidence of one will, one health, one soil, one sun." Yet we will not begin here with soil chemistry and root development. Rather, I will simply assert, and be prepared to argue on another occasion, that Nietzsche's metaphysics and epistemology are radically different from Rand's, and that those differences lead to substantial differences and outright oppositions in their views of human nature and ethics. As evidence of the latter, we will sample representative quotations that indicate that Nietzsche's and Rand's positive ethical systems are at the very least not members of the same species, and more likely not even members of the same genus. The major differences between Nietzsche and Rand. Are individuals real? If one is to be an advocate of self-interest, it would be good to start by affirming that selves in fact do exist. For Rand, individual selves are real, and their core capacities should be integrated. Humans are mind-body integrates. Consciousness is both supported by the rest of the self and directs the self. An individual's sensory and perceptual capacities are integrated. Their perceptual and rational capacities are and should be integrated. Their rational and emotional capacities are connected and should be integrated. The life of an individual is and should be a unified whole. Nietzsche argues the opposite. The human being is the combat of, quote, a vast confusion of contradictory valuations and consequently of contradictory drives, unquote. With respect to the role of consciousness, Nietzsche asserts that consciousness is not, quote, the unity of the organism, unquote. And he suggests strongly that we should dispense altogether with talk of individual selves. Quote, the assumption of one single subject is perhaps unnecessary, unquote. Quote, for the individual, the single man, as people and philosophers have hitherto understood him, is an error. He does not constitute a separate entity, an atom, a link in the chain, something merely inherited from the past. He constitutes the entire single line man up to and including himself, unquote. In contrast to Rand, then, for whom the individual is the unit of reality and moral significance, the above quotations suggest that to Nietzsche, the so-called individual is a conflicted and historically collective vehicle through which biological evolution is working. Do individuals have free will? Egoism is a thesis about morality. The existence of morality presupposes that moral agents make choices for which they can be held responsible. That presupposes that moral agents have the capacity of making choices. Rand argues this to be true of humans. Man's reason is a volitional capacity, one that is itself a species of causality, along with the various other species of mechanical and biological causality that exist. Whatever we take individual selves to be in Nietzsche's system, there is less uncertainty about his position on volition. He rejects it. We are, he writes, before, quote, a brazen wall of fate. We are in prison. We can only dream ourselves free, not make ourselves free, unquote. Further, as quoted above, quote, the single human being is a piece of fatum from the front and from the rear, one law more, one necessity more for all that is yet to come and to be, unquote. And again, quote, the voluntary is absolutely lacking. Everything has been directed along certain lines from the beginning, unquote. He ridicules the idea of volitional self-causation. Quote, the concept of a causa sui is something fundamentally absurd, unquote. In this respect, humans are no different from any other biological species. Quote, a man as he ought to be. That sounds to us as insipid as a tree as it ought to be, unquote. This has implications for character development, in contrast to Rand's belief that, quote, man is a being of self-made soul, unquote, and that men can be evaluated morally according to their choices and achievements. Nietzsche asserts a biological determinism. Quote, it cannot be effaced from a man's soul what his ancestors have preferably and most constantly done, unquote. And evaluatively, quote, there is only aristocracy of birth, only aristocracy of blood, unquote. As a result, it would make little sense for Nietzsche to make moral judgments of good or evil about individuals. Instead, Nietzsche's language is consistently populated by biomedical terms of healthy or sick, along with aesthetic judgments of beautiful and disgusting, both the biomedical and the aesthetic language to be purged of moral connotations. Quote, is it virtuous when a cell transforms itself into the function of a stronger cell? It has no alternative. Is it evil when a stronger cell assimilates the weaker? It also has no alternative. It follows necessity, unquote. Also, quote, weakness of the will, that is a simile that can mislead, for there is no will, and consequently neither a strong nor a weak will. The multiplicity and disgregation of the impulses, the lack of system among them results in a, quote, weak will, unquote. Their coordination under the dominance of a single one results in a, quote, unquote, strong will, unquote. So, in contrast to Rand, to the extent that Nietzsche is a biological determinist, he cannot be an advocate of ethical egoism. At most, he could be an advocate of psychological egoism. What is the source of moral values? Rand is among the few philosophers until recently who have argued that moral values are naturalistic and objective. Nietzsche is a pioneer in making ethics a naturalistic discipline, but he rejects moral objectivism and argues for a radical subjectivity. In part, this is a consequence of his general epistemological subjectivism. Quote, "Genuine philosophers," he writes, "are commanders and legislators. They say, 'Thus it shall be.' Their knowing is creating. Their creating is a legislation. Their will to truth is will to power." Unquote. And in part, his subjectivism is a consequence of his biological determinism. Quote, "It is always necessary to draw forth the physiological phenomenon behind the moral predispositions and prejudices." Unquote. When we do so, we learn that, quote, "Our moral judgments and evaluations are only images and fantasies based on a physiological process unknown to us." Unquote. All of this is in stark contrast to the thesis of the author of The Objectivist Ethics, and logically leads to further differences in content and method. How does the self identify its nature and values? Another such difference concerns the role of reason in Nietzsche's and Rand's ethical systems. For Rand, reason is one of the cardinal values, and rationality is the primary virtue. It is reason that is an individual's primary means of survival. Developed and used well, it is a powerful tool by which humans can develop themselves and transform their world. Reason, again properly used, shapes one's passions and should work harmoniously with them. If there is a conflict between the two, though, reason should prevail, for of the two, only reason is a tool of cognition, and action in the world should be governed by an individual's best cognitive grasp of the world. For Nietzsche, by contrast, thinking is both derivative of passions and a less significant source of guidance for action. Thinking, he argues, is only, quote, "the form in which we come to feel," unquote. The human being is a collection of conflicting, as above, instinctual biological drives, and those drives manifest themselves psychologically in the forms of felt passions and desires. Some of those passions and desires further manifest themselves as conscious, rational experiences. As such, conscious, rational judgments are hardly to be regarded as legislative of action. Since reason and consciousness are as a whole are Johnny-come-lately capacities, they are less reliable than the instinctual capacities and drives that have served us well for millennia. Nietzsche explicitly expresses pity for humans as they have come to rely more on reason. Quote, "In this new world, they no longer possess their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ." Unquote. In most cases, Nietzsche holds, reason is at best rationalization, and as a general policy of action, it is an either-or alternative. Quote, "rationality against instinct." Unquote. Consequently, while Rand exalts the power of reason and makes its exercise fundamental to her ethics of egoism, Nietzsche is mostly dismissive of the whole apparatus of consciousness, reason included, and exalts, quote, "unconscious and infallible drives." Unquote. So while Rand advocates rational self-interest, Nietzsche does not. Are individual selves ends in themselves? The key normative thesis of egoism is that individuals are ends in themselves. They are not merely tools, servants, or slaves of other individuals or alleged higher beings or institutions. Individuals exist for their own sake. The oath taken by the inhabitants of Galt's Gulch is Rand's literary statement of egoism. Quote, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." Unquote. Those who reject egoism argue that individuals are not ends in themselves, that individuals exist as a means to some other end. By this criterion, Nietzsche is not an egoist at all. For Nietzsche, the value of an individual is measured in terms of that individual's ability to advance the species. Here is a quotation from Twilight of the Idols. Quote, "The value of egoism depends on the physiological value of him who possesses it. It can be very valuable. It can be worthless and contemptible. Every individual may be regarded as representing the ascending or descending line of life. When one has decided which, one has thereby established a canon for the value of his egoism. If he represents the ascending line, his value is in fact extraordinary. For the sake of the life collective, which with him takes a step forward, the care expended on his preservation, on the creation of optimum conditions for him, may even be extreme." Unquote. Note that the advance of, quote, "the life collective," unquote, is the standard of value, not the advance of the individual. If an individual contributes to the advance of the life collective, then egoism is an appropriate policy for that individual. Continuing the same quotation, Nietzsche makes it clear that egoism is bad in the case of most other individuals. Most individuals, we recall, are a disgrace to Nietzsche's aspirations for the species, and so egoism is the wrong policy to urge upon them. Quote, "If he represents a declining line, then he has little value, and the first demand of justice is that he take as little room, force, and sunshine from the well-bred as possible. In this case, society has the duty of suppressing egoism." Unquote. Nietzsche does not here explain what methods society might use to suppress egoism, but the point is clear. For the large majority of the human population, Nietzsche is anti-egoistic. Quote, "To ordinary human beings, finally, the vast majority who exist for service and the general advantage, and who may exist only for that," unquote. And more ruthlessly, quote, "Mankind in the mass, sacrificed to the prosperity of a single stronger species of man, that would be an advance," unquote. For all that Nietzsche attacks Christianity's altruism, a striking point is that one of his later criticisms of Christianity is that it is too egoistic. It is too individualistic, seeing each human being as precious and as not to be sacrificed for the good of the species. Consequently, he warns, quote, "If one regards individuals as equal, one calls the species into question. One encourages a way of life that leads to the ruin of the species," unquote. The value of egoism, then, is to Nietzsche measured by evaluating the individual's capacity for advancing the species. Even for those rare, higher individuals, self-sacrifice is for Nietzsche their highest calling, for it is through their sacrifices that the better kind of man will come into being. Quote, "I love those who sacrifice themselves for the earth, that the earth may someday become the overman's," unquote. So while one can find many passages in Nietzsche in praise of egoism, those passages must be interpreted as being directed only to a few exceptional individuals, not the vast majority of individuals, and in the context of knowing that for Nietzsche, those individuals are themselves only the means to a higher end, an end for which they should sacrifice themselves when necessary. Nietzsche's egoism is thus severely limited in scope and nested within a broader expectation of sacrifice for an end beyond man. Are fundamental values universal? Two closely related points are at work here. One is that Nietzsche's standard of value is collectivist, that which is species advancing. The other is that since he divides the species into two basic types, the master and slave types, the value of the egoist code is relative to the values of the two human types. By contrast, Rand's ethic is individualist and universalist. Her standard of value is the life of the individual, and the egoist code is the appropriate code for all individuals. Nietzsche's subjectivism also contributes to his relativism. As above, he argues that moral codes are conscious projections of psychophysiological types, with different types projecting different codes, the master and the slave codes being the two basic types. If one is more master-like, the master code will feel right and the slave code disgusting. And if one is more slave-like, the slave code will feel right and the master code frightening. Nietzsche denies an objective criterion or perspective by which to evaluate codes, so one can, it seems, evaluate codes only subjectively. Justice, for example, is, quote, by all means a matter of taste, nothing more, unquote. Yet Nietzsche often does also adopt an implicit, lowercase o, objectivist stance in claiming that the slave code represents a decline of the species and urging the redevelopment of master codes as the only route to genuine human improvement. Quote, the ideas of the herd should rule the herd, but not reach out beyond it, unquote. And those few of us with master potential should live a code that enables the development of that potential. So there is a core problem remaining for Nietzsche's scholarship. Is Nietzsche arguing with a forked tongue, so to speak, in holding that slave values are objectively bad and that his revulsion toward them is only a subjective response on his part? Is his sympathy to master values merely an expression of his biophysiology and a recommendation of a code that is in fact best for humanity? Are the relations of individuals win-win or win-lose? Rand's ethic is striking for its argument that no conflicts of interest exist among rational human beings. Self-responsible, productive individuals are value creators, and it is to the mutual self-interest of all such individuals that other such individuals exist and flourish. The basic principle of social interaction, then, is the principle of voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange, what Rand called the trader principle in her notes for Galt's speech. For Nietzsche, by contrast, quote, culture absolutely cannot do without passions, vices, and acts of malice, unquote. Conflicts of interest are fundamental and inescapable. Quote, here one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. But why should one forever use precisely these words on which for ages a disparaging purpose has been stamped? Unquote. Again, quote, people now rave everywhere, even under the guise of science, about coming conditions of society in which the exploiting character is to be absent. That sounds to my ear as if they promised to invent a mode of life which should refrain from all organic functions, unquote. Any code, then, requires the sacrifice of some for the benefit of others. The altruist code calls for the sacrifice of the strong to the weak, and the egoist code is for Nietzsche simply the converse. Quote, there is no egoism that remains by itself and does not encroach. One furthers one's I always at the expense of others, unquote. And putting the point in terms of Nietzsche's opposition of the master and slave moralities, quote, the well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value, unquote. Consequently, rather than committing to peaceful and voluntary trade with others, Nietzsche urges war, at least metaphorically, in the following famous Live Dangerously quotation. Quote, the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities under Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. Live at war with your peers and yourselves. Unquote. Rights, liberty, equality before the law. All of the above differences between Nietzsche and Rand naturally lead to major differences in social and political philosophy. Rand's strong advocacy of individual rights is a consequence of her egoism. Individuals' lives are their own to live, and the mutual recognition of that fact is an objective value to individuals in a social context. Rights are, quote, the concept that preserves and protects individual morality in a social context, unquote. That mutual recognition is best institutionalized in the form of explicit rights that apply universally and are protected equally. Quote, a complex legal system based on objectively valid principles is required to make a society free and keep it free, unquote. Rand's ethical egoism is thus integrated with her political liberalism. Nietzsche, by direct and accurate contrast, proclaims that he is, quote, not by any means liberal, unquote. Liberalism is only one more manifestation of the slave morality. Quote, liberalism, in plain language, reduction to the herd animal, unquote. The freedom of the large majority of human beings, Nietzsche believes, is an obstacle to the advancement of the species. In the first part of Zarathustra, Nietzsche complains that, quote, all too many live, and all too long they hang on their branches. Would that a storm came to shake all this worm-eaten rot from the tree, unquote. The state is the creation of, quote, a conqueror and master race which, organized for war, and with the force to organize unhesitatingly, lays its terrible claws upon a populace, perhaps tremendously superior in numbers, but still formless and wandering, unquote. This is not a bad thing, for a healthy ruling class, quote, accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of untold human beings who, for its sake, must be reduced and lowered to incomplete human beings, to slaves, to instruments, unquote. But good conscience has been poisoned by the slave morality, so Nietzsche's serious goal, as he puts it, is, quote, the cultivation of a new caste that will rule Europe, unquote. Consequently, while Rand argues forcefully for the equality of rights and equality before the law, quote, equality in a human context is a political term. It means equality before the law, the equality of fundamental, inalienable rights which every man possesses by virtue of his birth as a human being, and which may not be infringed or abrogated by man-made institutions, such as titles of nobility or the division of men into castes established by law, with special privileges granted to some and denied to others, unquote. Nietzsche argues the exact opposite, quote, for the preservation of society, for making possible higher and highest types, the inequality of rights is the condition, unquote. Slavery and freedom, war and peace. The vocabulary of slavery and war are regular and, given the above, logically consequential features of Nietzsche's writings. Rand's condemnation of slavery is clear. She praises the Enlightenment system that, quote, drove slavery out of the civilized world, unquote. She singles out the United States for praise, quote, the nation that ran an underground railroad to help human beings escape from slavery, unquote. She recognizes the stain of slavery in parts of early America. Quote, certainly slavery was an enormous evil, but a country that fought a civil war to abolish slavery has atoned for it, unquote. And she identifies slavery's great immorality in its violation of individual rights. Quote, no people and no country has the right to choose a system of slavery. There can be no such thing as the right to violate rights, unquote. The moral and political codes that liberate men are for Rand among the highest achievements of civilization. Nietzsche, by contrast, holds that progressive society, quote, needs slavery in some sense or other, unquote. What sense or other? He is sometimes vague, seeking, quote, a noble mode of thought that believes in slavery and in many degrees of subjection as the presupposition of every higher culture, unquote. Or wondering, quote, to what extent a sacrifice of freedom, even enslavement itself, gives the basis for the bringing forth of a higher type, unquote. Yet in other cases, Nietzsche is well past the stage of wondering and advocates slavery in all forms. Quote, slavery is, as it seems, both in the cruder and in the more subtle sense, the indispensable means of spiritual discipline and cultivation too, unquote. For the vast number of individuals who have no value in themselves, Nietzsche is open to their having some value as tools to be used by the master types to bring about species-advancing ends. On issues of war and peace, Nietzsche and Rand are again fundamentally opposed. The system of individual rights, Rand argues, is, quote, the only system that bans force from social relationships. By the nature of its basic principles and interests, it is the only system fundamentally opposed to war, unquote. As a matter of moral principle, individual rights ban the use of force, except in cases of self-defense. As a matter of interests, individuals living in systems of individual rights develop trading relationships, and peace is to the interest of traders while war is destructive of trade. Rand points to the relatively free capitalist 19th century as historical evidence. Quote, Let those who are actually concerned with peace observe that capitalism gave mankind the longest period of peace in history, a period during which there were no wars involving the entire civilized world, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. War for Nietzsche is an indispensable tool. Those attempting to survive and advance in a general zero-sum world cannot, on principle, rule out war, and often should embrace war as a strategic instrument. Quote, "One must learn from war. One must learn to sacrifice many and to take one's cause seriously enough not to spare men." Unquote. Nietzsche also praises war's psychological benefits in developing a better kind of man. Quote, "I welcome all signs that a more virile, warlike age is about to begin, which will restore honor to courage above all. For this age shall prepare the way for one yet higher, and it shall gather the strength that this higher age will require one day, the age that will carry heroism into the search for knowledge, and that will wage wars for the sake of ideas and their consequences." Unquote. The horrific religious wars of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation were, for Nietzsche, a major achievement for men. Quote, "Religious war has signified the greatest progress of the masses hitherto, for it proves that the mass has begun to treat concepts with respect." Unquote. War thus has been a symptom and means of the elevation of mankind, and Nietzsche argues it is absolutely necessary for that end. Quote, "War essential. It is vain rhapsodizing and sentimentality to continue to expect much, even more to expect a very great deal from mankind once it has learned not to wage war. For the time being, we know of no other means to imbue exhausted peoples as strongly and surely as every great war does, with that raw energy of the battleground, that deep impersonal hatred, that murderous cold-bloodedness with a good conscience, that communal, organized ardor in destroying the enemy, that proud indifference to great losses, to one's own existence and to that of one's friends, that muted, earthquake-like convulsion of the soul." Unquote. Consequently, Nietzsche has nothing but scorn for the trade and peace liberals of his day. Quote, "Our liberal representatives, as is well known, lack the time for reflecting on the nature of man. Else they would know that they work in vain when they work for a gradual decrease of the military burden." Unquote. Conclusion. My hope is that this essay will contribute to putting to rest the traditional widespread and careless identifications of Nietzsche's and Rand's ethical philosophies, and to stronger interpretations of similarities and differences between the two. Nietzsche has acquired his place in the history of philosophy canon, and Rand is moving strongly in that direction. It is usual for that process in the first generation or two to be messy and marked with half-truths, under-researched speculations, cheap shots, and propaganda warfare. Yet in the context of the history of philosophy, there are major similarities in Nietzsche's and Rand's ethical theories. Both are naturalists, which puts them on the same side against the supernaturalists and the nihilists. Both see ethics in functional terms, identifying the good with the practical and the healthy, which puts them on the same side against the deontologists and those who advocate an opposition between the moral and the practical. Both have great contempt for the quote-unquote last man and quote-unquote social metaphysician type of human being, and hostility for altruism, which puts them on the same side against the conformists and the small-minded self-sacrifices. Further, both Nietzsche and Rand embody a high romanticism, exalting life's challenges and noble quests. Both are philosophical and literary geniuses, who integrate the content of their philosophies with brilliant romantic rhetoric. And in temperament, both combine a gentle, delicate sensibility with a cold, hard warrior edge. That puts them on the same side against fluffy sentimentalism and the turgid academic style common to much philosophical prose. So there certainly is something to a first glance highly abstracted connection between Nietzsche's and Rand's views. But a closer examination does not bear out that connection. On the negative issue, the critique of altruism, Nietzsche and Rand do not agree on the most important issue of whether altruism is the egoism of the weak. On the positive issue, the advocacy of egoism. It is not clear that Nietzsche believes in the existence of egos, and Nietzsche disagrees entirely with all 12 constituent elements of Rand's egoist philosophy. In consequence, they disagree entirely on the social and political implications of their ethical theories for issues of freedom or slavery, political equality or aristocracy, production and trade or war. And, while the issues are outside the scope of this essay, Nietzsche and Rand disagree fundamentally on the issues of metaphysics, epistemology, and human nature. Those disagreements lead logically to their radical divergences in ethics and politics. Let me suggest one further moral of the story of why Rand is still regularly lumped in with Nietzsche. That it is still hard for many thinkers to conceive of an egoism that is not zero-sum. Say that Rand is a realist, a naturalist, and an advocate of reason, and most people know what that means and can articulate those positions accurately. In the last generation or so, it has become increasingly possible to say that Rand is an advocate of capitalism, and find that many people will understand what that means, and that it is not necessarily vicious dog-eat-dog exploitation. But the same is not yet true when it comes to ethical egoism. Egoism to most still means stereotypical selfishness, and to many the only alternative is altruism. So there is still much work to do in overcoming the traditional false alternative. End of Egoism in Nietzsche and Rand by Stephen Hicks, published in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, Volume 10, Number 2, 2009.